So the time has finally come. You have been waiting for this day for what seems like forever, and you've either saved up the money or you've sold off a bunch of guitars to justify such an extravagant purchase. But that day is here. You finally got your vintage Fender offset guitar. Now, whether you have gotten yourself a vintage Jaguar, like this beautiful body only refinish Sonic Blue Jaguar from 1965, or a Jazzmaster or Mustang or a Duosonic, whatever it might be. One of the most common things that I, as well as my clients, have unfortunately had to deal with when buying vintage instruments from online platforms like Reverb or eBay is that what you get in hand after spending that much money is unfortunately not exactly what was sold to you as far as the descriptions, as far as what pictures tell. Now, most sellers, for the most part, are pretty honest and are forthcoming with whatever details they may have on these vintage offsets. However, a lot of things end up slipping through the cracks. There's a lot of information that folks don't know, especially if these are, family heirlooms or things that someone might be selling because one of their family members had passed away or maybe gifted it to them. So today we are going to be talking about all of the things that you should be on the lookout for when you go to buy a vintage Fender offset, or maybe you've already bought one and you are not quite sure whether what you got is exactly what it claimed to be. I'm also going to be covering the questions that you most definitely should be asking of the merchant or seller, regardless of which platform you decide to use. And most definitely, if you're going to be buying from something like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, which personally, unless you know exactly what to look out for, I would definitely stay away from, especially because it's easy to get got, as they say. So this one came into me and my client was super stoked because he had been in the market for a vintage Jag for a while, and it was sold as a body only refinish Jaguar with all original parts. They were pretty forthcoming with regards to the fact that the only thing that was non-original was the vibrato arm. And despite my client doing his due diligence and trying to figure it out himself, he was still pretty anxious about whether this Jaguar was exactly what it had been claimed to be. So he brought it to me to check out and unfortunately found a number of surprising things. Now, the first thing he had discovered on his own was checking the outputs of the pickups, and he had noticed that the hotter pickup was, for whatever reason, in the neck position, and so we had deduced that probably some point during the refinish, and this refinish looks pretty old. It doesn't have weather checking, but if I were to guess, I would say this refinish is probably somewhere between 10 and 20 years old. It definitely is a nitro lacquer finish, and it's quite thin. There's no undercoat here or a primer coat. And this body had originally been Sonic Blue, right? Much like the headstock here, which you can see has gone very green over time, but you can still see kind of peaks of that blue underneath the decal where the UV rays have not affected the finish as much. Now, when getting a vintage guitar, there are the very obvious things that are undeniable, such as the neck stamp. So the neck stamp on this thing was a March 1965 with B signifying a B width neck, and it had the number code in the front that was signifying that it was a Fender Jaguar. One thing to look out for is sometimes folks will try to pass on a guitar like a Jaguar as all original, and in fact it had been pieced together. And I've seen this a number of times. Dishonest folks, or maybe unknowledgeable folks, will put a vintage Mustang neck, which is definitely worth decidedly less than a vintage Jaguar neck, because those were student models, and you can tell that by looking at the first digits in the neck stamp. So in the case of this one, as well as most vintage Jaguars, that first numeral that you will see is the number 1, which signifies that it is indeed a Fender Jaguar. Now, as I said at the top, after this thing finally hit my bench, there were a number of unfortunate and unexpected things that I discovered on this Jaguar. The first being that I was not able to actually pull the tremolo upwards. It felt very similar to Jaguars that I've been working on recently that are made in Mexico, where the route for the vibrato is just a bit too small, and that the guts of the vibrato ends up grinding up against the wall. So I was bracing myself for the worst, thinking at first that maybe there was an excessive amount of paint inside of the vibrato cavity, and I really was not looking forward to having to sand that out, or at worst, you know, have to reroute that, because that would definitely devalue the instrument some. The next thing that I had found that had not been disclosed to my client was the fact that this guitar at some point in its life had been refret. And the reason why I had come to the conclusion that this had been refret is just from experience doing refrets on vintage guitars myself, as well as just visually speaking. This is from March of 1965 is when this neck was produced. So Fender at this time was still using Brazilian rosewood fretboards. And one of the hallmarks of Brazilian rosewood fretboards from this era, even on ones that have been, you know, babied over the course of their lifetime, is that you will see a lot of pitting in these old Brazilian rosewood fretboards. And you can see here that the majority of this board is almost dead flat. And so that leads me to the conclusion that this had been planed and re-radiused back to, you know, 7 1/4 specs based on what I was able to measure myself here. But it's definitely been planed. And another thing that you can tell, one of the tells, this is not definitive, but it's one of the things that I look out for. But if you look very closely here, you can see that the slots for the frets are much deeper than the frets themselves. And so that leads to the possibility that this guitar has had its fret slots cleaned and opened up and then filled with glue before pressing or hammering these frets back in. Again, that's not necessarily definitive, but when I compared to a vintage Mustang, for example, that I have here that does have its original frets, I didn't really see too much of that. And also because the fretboards of the vintage Fenders that I do have here that have Brazilian rosewood boards do have a lot of that iconic pitting in the fretboard. Now, another thing on this guitar that had very clearly been changed, but not disclosed in the listing, was the fact that the original nut had been replaced, likely at the same time as whenever it had had its refret. And so it's very, very easy to tell if the nut is original. Obviously, it can be faked. I'm not a friggin' archaeologist working at Jurassic Park over here. So I do not have the scientific tools to be able to carbon date a friggin' bone nut. But as far as visually speaking, you can tell a lot of times whether the nut is original because it's got kind of an amberish kind of color to it. And it's definitely very shiny. And one easy way to be able to tell whether something is actually bone is by heating up like a thumbtack or a pin something hopefully that has like a plastic bit so that you don't burn yourself. But after you touch that heated element to the side of bone, it's not actually going to be burning or melting. But this is the nut material that was on this guitar. It broke immediately after pulling it out, and you can see that this is one of the plastic or melamine nuts that Fender has used on its mid-range guitars for forever, essentially. You can see the casting marks from this thing. So yeah, that definitely wasn't original, and my client wanted it to be restored back to a bone nut, which I did for him. Now, everything else here seemed to check out. It has the double line Clusen tuners, which are appropriately aged. I pulled one of these and saw that the stamps inside of the double line Clusens are indeed vintage. My client had replaced already, because he is a mastery a mastery fiend. But before he even handed this to me, he had already replaced the original string tree with the mastery string tree. And the guard here is definitely the original pick guard. Now, they had switched by 1965 away from celluloid, and this is either a PVC or ABS kind of material. So unlike earlier examples of white guards, and yeah, this guard did originally look white when it was first produced, you will see by the mid 60s that the guards that you get are a lot flatter than their earlier celluloid counterparts from the pre-CBS period. I made a number of other unfortunate discoveries. The first thing that I went to tackle was the issue with the vibrato. And when I went to unscrew the vibrato, I had discovered that this thing was using pick guard screws to hold the vibrato down. And in fact, these screws that they are using aren't even the standard pick guard screws that Fender used, not back in the day, not in the modern day. They were even smaller. This thing was literally defying the laws of physics, because under tension, based on the size of those tiny screws, this thing should have immediately lifted off of the body, but somehow it didn't. The other thing that I discovered based on what my client had found, and he told me, was that those same tiny screws were used throughout the entire guitar. So all of the little screws here to hold down the plates and the pick guard were identical to those screws. So unless Fender was just had run out of their typical supply back in the day, which is just, you know, it's plausible, right? Fender was known to do whatever the hell they needed to do to make it work. But it's highly uncommon, and most likely whoever had owned this in the past saw it fit to replace all those screws for one reason or another. Maybe because the screws had been rusted over and they wanted the guitar to look more clean. I have no idea, but that was another thing that was not original. Now, thankfully, when I did finally get the vibrato off, I had discovered what was causing that vibrato arm to get stuck when trying to pull up. And it was because about probably 2 inches worth of wire, the ground wire that's lined from the electronic circuit to ground your vibrato and effectively your strings and bridge as well, that was then getting caught between the bottom plate of the vibrato, the one that moves as you depress and pull on the tremolo arm, and the actual walls of the vibrato itself. And so pulling that wire back and only having just the exposed wire sandwiched underneath the vibrato fixed that issue immediately. Now, with the vibrato arm issue solved, I moved on to swapping the pickup positions because, as I said before, unfortunately, the positions had been swapped so that the much hotter pickup was in the neck position and the weaker one in the bridge. And what I discovered there was that, unfortunately, sometime during this guitar's life, someone had shortened the leads for the pickups, so much so that after putting the neck pickup back in its rightful place, I was not able to orient the pickup in a way that allowed the claws to be in the proper orientation. Now, I don't know if you all know this, but the purpose of the Jaguar's claws are to focus the magnetic field, which makes the pickup sound like punchier, brighter, louder, on top of actually shielding out unwanted noises from the pickups. And supposedly, when oriented properly, the shorter teeth of these claws, which you can see are currently facing the treble strings, are actually supposed to be oriented so that the short teeth are facing the bass strings, right? Was able to get that right on the bridge pickup here, as you can see, but unfortunately did not have enough lead left to be able to orient the neck pickup properly. Now, there's been a lot of debate whether the orientation of those claws actually makes a difference on a Jag. To my ears, I literally hear no difference, and I've seen everything from vintage guitars to modern reissues like the American Vintage reissues, and all of their various iterations like the American Original 60s, the AB65. I've seen the Japanese ones, as well as Squire ones with those claws oriented the wrong way, and I have never really found it to affect the sound in any sort of noticeable way. Now, that said, there are some tests that folks have done on whether removing the claw does change the character of Jaguar pickups, and indeed, supposedly, it does. So that is something that folks who are curious can experiment with. I haven't done it myself firsthand, so take that information with a grain of salt. But yeah, fun little fact there. Now, checking the pots and the switches on this, everything else looked original. The pots dated to the 5th month of 1965, which puts it around the same time that this neck was produced. This is an earlier 65 Jaguar, so you will notice that unlike a lot of other 65s, which is technically the transition era, CBS had bought Fender in January of 1965, and you would not start to see a lot of those iconic changes until mid-1965, and that is when the Jaguar and the Jazzmaster first donned their bound necks with the pearloid dot inlays. This one, like other early 65s, does have the pearloid inlays, right? These are not clay dots, but does not feature the binding. Now, the most major thing that I had to deal with on this guitar, which was sold as having frets that were in excellent condition, my fret rocker had a lot to say otherwise, because this little sheet of paper here shows you just how many high spots I found across all of the frets of this Jaguar, and as such, because it also had a lot of deep, like really deep divots in the cowboy chord or open chord area, all the way up to the 9th fret. This thing definitely needed a fret leveling, crowning, dressing, and polish for it to play its best. Now, thankfully, it had a pretty significant amount of life left. This was at about 36 thousandths on average on the treble side, and on the bass side is where we were veering into dangerous territory or extremely low territory, because on average these were about, I think, 26 27, 26 thousandths or so. So I knew that I had to really kind of be careful during that leveling process to not take off too much material, because once you start to get lower than 20 thousandths, right, that is where you will start to run into issues with everything from, unfortunately, you know, fretting out or having kind of like a dead notes not ringing out properly, and just overall just feeling like way too low to be able to effectively play the guitar the way that it's intended. Thankfully, there was enough here, and I only removed a minuscule amount on the bass side, so that the final height on this side was about 24 thousandths or so, and we ended up with something like I think like 34 or 33 thousandths on the treble side. So this still has enough life left, I would say, probably for one more fret leveling job, but then after that I probably would recommend that this guitar be refret. And that is where things can get a little bit dicey with vintage instruments, right? Because assuming that my my assessment before was that this guitar had already been leveled once, if not multiple times before, these guitars, particularly these veneer fretboards, you can see just how thin now that rosewood veneer is starting to get here, right? So if this is brought to another tech that deems it fit from there to once again plane the fretboard, you can imagine that there's only a certain amount of times that can be done to clean out the fret slots. You're literally going to be cutting into the maple, which is not ideal. At that point, some folks opt to have the fingerboard or the fretboard completely replaced, which would just be a travesty, especially because these vintage Brazilian rosewood boards are just so gorgeous. Now, there are two other things on this guitar that are not original, that weren't disclosed. The first thing that was non-original were these strap pins, and I know that because I compared these strap pins against all of my other vintage Fenders, and the flange on these is definitely this area here where it's a kind of like chamfered is a lot thicker than that of a vintage Fender, and also the way that the little like waist of that strap pin and the overall shape of this is just not correct for a vintage Fender from this era. I actually have my 1965, and that one is from September 65, and I also have a 65, I believe it's also a March 1965 Jazzmaster here that I compared. Both of those verified have their original strap pins. So yeah, and also this was crudely filled with like matchsticks or something, because they had stripped the holes for it. So that was another thing that I had to repair on this. The other thing that is up for debate here a bit is we did end up installing a mastery bridge on here, and based on mastery's documentation, Jaguars, Jazzmasters, Mustangs before 2012, and that includes vintage ones, should not have to replace the thimbles for the mastery to properly lock. And the thimbles in this case, they looked old, but I was getting quite a bit of play, you know, when I had installed the mastery into the thimbles that came on this guitar. So it very well could be that those were not original, or maybe the tolerances for the manufacturing of vintage thimbles had some variance in them, which led me to have to then, you know, extract the thimbles that came on this guitar and pop in the actual genuine mastery ones and now thankfully there is no rock. One of the reasons why you don't want a mastery to rock is because, number one, it's intended to be a fixed or stationary bridge, and when there is a slight amount of play, you can hear like kind of a little bit of clicking or the mastery kind of knocking into the walls, because the way that the bridge posts of the mastery are designed, they are not supposed to be moving back and forth, and ended up having a bit of an audible noise, an unwanted one at that. And so thankfully, after putting in the genuine mastery thimbles, and then also aiding it a bit by adding a tiny bit of lubrication in both the saddles of the bridge as well as the nut slots, then instead of trying to pull on the saddles here, it was nicely gliding over them as intended. Now, the last thing, and also one that is cause for concern for a lot of folks when it comes to not even just vintage guitars, but all guitars, is making sure that you have a properly operating truss rod. And when I had completely backed out the nut of the truss rod here, under tension, I was able to get the 10,000ths of an inch amount of relief when you capo the first fret, depress the last fret, and check between the top of the 8th fret and the bottom of your high and low E strings. But actually, I didn't do that, and I just used my StewMac neck relief gauge here, and yeah, I was getting about that 10,000ths, which you know, led me to conclude that this guitar was going to be totally fine. Ideally, you would like to be able to have more relief and be able to dial in even more relief than that. I find that on you know, modern guitars with healthy truss rods, you can get upwards of 20,000, some of them 30,000ths of relief. But yeah, this one was basically just able to get 10,000ths. So for folks that want a bit more up bow to their neck, perhaps this particular guitar would have needed to be returned. But for the way that I set these up, this thing plays gorgeous. There's no fret buzz whatsoever. The neck is almost dead straight. Nice low buzz-free action on this, and so again, that's not cause for concern, but something to be aware of, and something to definitely ask after, especially if you are going to be buying this guitar from an independent seller. Now, I think that if you don't have the necessary tools, you don't have the knowledge or information, and you can't be effed to look those bits up or verify from the expertise of the offset guitar community, such as that one over on offsetguitars.com, then I definitely would bring your guitar to like a vintage guitar specialist to have it authenticated, because you know, that is not something that most folks are equipped to be able to do, especially after, you know, you throw up like $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 on a vintage instrument. You want to be able to sleep soundly knowing that you got exactly what you were supposedly sold. So so yeah, going over all of those things again, the most obvious things that you're going to want to check if you buy vintage is check that neck stamp. For example, if the first number on the neck stamp of your 1962 to 1968 Jaguar is anything other than a 1, you know that someone put like a Mustang or a Duosonic 2 or Music Master neck on a Jaguar body and is trying to sell it to you as original. So that is one thing. Check your pot dates, right? And also, especially for you know, 65 and before, check to see that there is a body date. Now, professional refinishers, ones like Joe Riggio, for example, are keen to make sure to retain all the visible evidence required to show what the original finish was, which unfortunately this guitar did not. The neck pocket had been completely sprayed over on this, and unfortunately there was no evidence of a body date, but I can just tell visually speaking on this, and just my knowledge and expertise on vintage offsets, I could tell very clearly that this is a vintage Jaguar body. And also the neck plate checks out as well to a 65 era, early 65 era neck plate. Later in 65 you will start to see the F stamped neck plates. The other thing that you're going to want to check, and it's not definitive again, because people can do a really great job of doing invisible kind of oversprays or refins, but is checking with a black light. If it's the original finish, you should be able to see that original finish like really glow in a vibrant way underneath a black light. And if it looks dull, or it looks like it's not really glowing that much at all, then your guitar at minimum could very well have been oversprayed, which is basically when folks spray a new layer of nitro lacquer over the old one. Now, another question that my client had about this guitar was, why did it have black bobbin pickups instead of gray bobbin ones? And yes, while Fender started to ship guitars with gray bobbin pickups back in 1964, Fender was also known to, again, use whatever it is that they had on hand to build their guitars. And so you very often will see little inconsistencies like that, and you could just tell from the age of the pickups in this guitar. The actual foams, for example, had melted. They were hard and brittle as a rock, and they smelled horrible. But yeah, you could just tell that these were the original pickups to this guitar. A lot of times you will be able to see little handwritten dates on here. Now, these pickups were just so fragile, especially if you're trying to do things like remove foam or try to remove the covers and separate those from the claws. There is a very high risk that you may end up breaking a coil wire, which would then result in you having to rewind the pickups. And even if you wind them to the same spec, I have found that rewinds do not sound exactly like an original pickup that is intact. So that is something that if you get a vintage guitar and you're trying to authenticate this thing yourself and verify the parts yourself, is just be careful, especially around those pickups. You know, they are very fragile, especially after 60+ years in existence. Don't be heavy-handed when handling them. That's all I can say. Another thing that you are definitely going to want to ask the seller before buying a vintage Fender is, what is the condition of the frets? Any reputable seller should be able to tell you how much fret life a guitar has. And so I have had the experience from folks where they don't have calipers on hand because they are just, you know, Joe Schmo who inherited this guitar from their dad or their grandpa or something. And, you know, that's no fault of their own. But when it comes to buying a vintage instrument, especially if they don't have, you know, a robust return policy like brick and mortar stores or more reputable, well-known storefronts out there, then you run the risk of paying a lot of money for a guitar and then having to pay even more money to potentially have the guitar need a refret. And again, like I said before, especially with these Fenders that do not have the slab boards, there is that risk that it has been planed, the fretboard has been planed so many times from multiple refrets that eventually that fretboard altogether is going to need to be replaced. So you're definitely going to want to compare just how thick, if you can see, right? You're going to want to compare to see how thick that rosewood veneer still is, because if it is looking a lot thinner than, you know, pictures that you can find online. That should definitely give you cause for concern if the owner or whoever is selling the guitar is unsure whether the guitar has been refret before. Now, if the seller does have calipers or sends you photos that showcase like really flat looking frets, a lot of these vintage Fenders that I've seen, particularly refins that I've seen that are being sold by everyday people, unfortunately have had their frets very crudely leveled by amateurs. And so if you see like really flat frets, really low frets, that definitely is something, again, to consider, that you are most likely going to have to invest more money. And if you are getting a reading from you know, a seller that does have calipers on hand, and they are telling you that the frets are pretty close to 20 thousandths or maybe less than 20 thousandths of an inch high, that is definitely going to tell you that that guitar is going to need a refret very soon. Now, other things to look out for is verifying the dates of the pots, depending on whether they are CTS pots or stack pull pots. You can Google the dating conventions for pots and check them against the pots in yours. It was very common for Fender to, again, use up earlier stock that they have, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that a guitar like this might have pots that date back to 64, sometimes even 63. I have seen that before, and the guitars were indeed all original. So do not let that potentially dissuade you. Another thing that you can check too is the originality of the solder joints. A lot of these solder joints over time have gone cold. They'll have kind of like a dull appearance to them. So if you see a lot of those solder points in the guitar being super shiny as if they were new, that definitely will tell you that the guitar at very minimum has been worked on, or that those solder points have been refreshed a lot more recently than when the guitar was produced. Take a look also, depending on the era that you get, what kind of tuners the guitars came with during that era, right? Again, by 1964, for example, Fender had switched over to the double line Klusons. Folks back in the day did a lot of stupid stuff like hanging their guitars by the goddamn tuners, and so folks would replace them. I've had vintage guitars come in here that were from, you know, 65 or later, and ended up having, you know, a single line Kluson as a replacement. So that's another thing to check. Other things that I can think of is when I had pulled this tremolo, a lot of these vintage tremolo units had black springs to them. You'll also notice here that folks who are really bad at relicking will try to scuff using like micro mesh or steel wool to give the appearance of like an aged finish on these. On an actual vintage unit, you'll see that it's still quite shiny and does not have like micro scratches all across the unit, unlike, you know, on the Vintera 2 road worn, or even some of the custom shop ones. Again, if you do not have the constitution to kind of deep dive and verify the guitar yourself, definitely find a professional, hopefully someone that is really knowledgeable about offset guitars, to at minimum get you on a video chat, send them photos, video, whatever, to be able to verify that what you have is what you thought you bought. So yeah. that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, especially if you've been on the hunt for a vintage Jaguar, Jazzmaster, or Mustang. By no means was this supposed to be a comprehensive guide to buying vintage guitars, but just a couple of things that you should be thinking of, especially if you are ready to kind of pull the trigger on a vintage Fender offset yourself. If you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell. Be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And if you appreciate my channel and want to help my videos reach an even wider audience, definitely try out that new YouTube hype feature and hype up this video. You can find it on the mobile app by scrolling to the left where you see the comment tab. I'm not sure how you find it on desktop. It seems to be kind of random, but yeah, if you do that for me, I definitely would greatly appreciate it. And as always, don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars buying tips.